Hi there, my name's Paul Fenwick from Perl Training Australia, and today I'm going to be talking about the new autodie pragma for Perl 5.10. This is primarily a talk about error handling. If you've ever done any sort of error handling in Perl, you already know that it really sucks. Here's a typical statement that might give us an error from Perl. I'm opening a file. And here is the error handling code which I need to add to test to see if that open succeeds. As you'll notice, the error code is actually much more than the real code needed to test the statement. What this means is that writing bugs in Perl is easy, because if I have a simple statement like this, where I don't bother to check the return, I have a bug. What's worse is that these bugs can be quite insidious and difficult to find. Here I have a subroutine that finds and opens a file. It might take a file name, walk through a list of directories, and then return the file handle if it's successful in opening one. Otherwise, it returns an undefined value to say that it couldn't open a file. Now, this is expecting the person using the subroutine to check for that undefined value. Unfortunately, when these subroutines get used, often people don't check for those undefined values, and they simply pass them through to another subroutine. In this example, read header. Read header can take that file handle and try to read from it. Where we actually get the error reported from Perl is this line here, even though the actual error was in a completely different subroutine, quite some distance away. Damien Conway calls this sideways propagation, and it sucks in strange and interesting ways. But wouldn't it be nice if Perl could generate its own errors? Well, it actually can. Perl comes with a module called useFatal, and useFatal is very simple to use. You simply say useFatal and then the functions you want to throw errors, in this case useFatalOpen. Then I can simply open up a file, and if it does return an error, it gives me an exception, normally causing my program to stop. But what do those error messages look like that are produced from Fatal? Well, here's an error message which I'd probably be writing myself. I can't open somefile.txt for reading because there's no such file or directory. Here's the same error message that you'd get from Fatal. As you can see, it's way too ugly to show to a user. And unfortunately, it gets worse, because Fatal has a package-wide scope. This means that I might be trying to open a file, and then I might have hundreds of lines of code, and then somewhere deep inside a subroutine, somewhere else in my package, I could have said useFatalOpen. Unfortunately, the useFatal in my subroutine also influences the open in my main code. That can suck in a really strange and dangerous way if you weren't expecting it. So, let's fix it. If you're using Perl 5.10, you can now grab the autodie pragma. The autodie pragma works like this. Where you'd normally say useFatal, now you can simply say use autodie and supply exactly the same arguments. The important thing is that autodie has lexical scope, meaning it lasts until the end of the current block, file, or eval. So now, when I have my program that opens a file, and then I have my hundreds of lines of code, and a subroutine which uses autodie, the autodie inside the subroutine only changes the code inside the subroutine, and everything else works as expected. It also provides you with better error messages, rather than those absolutely terrible things which Fatal might give you. It instead gives you an error message pretty much as you'd write yourself. In fact, you can register your own error messages if you don't like the defaults. But Fatal also has another problem. Here I'm using Fatal to fatalize a whole bunch of different calls: open, close, change dir, and rename. And then I'm trying to use all of those calls in a block of code. But if I've got an error, how do I actually know which one failed and what the failure was? Autodie, however, gives me a better failure mechanism. When something dies due to autodie, it throws an exception object, and then using Perl 5.10's switch statement, I can say given that object, when it's undefined, there wasn't actually an error. When it corresponds to open, it means it was open that failed, but I can also test for other things. When it corresponds to IO, it was some sort of an IO error, and when it corresponds to all, it was some other autodie error. In fact, I can also use a default there if it was some sort of legacy error that didn't come from autodie at all. We can also use this to inspect the error if we want to. So here I am saving my error to a more meaningful name, and then I can say the subroutine that actually died was error goes to dying sub. The caller of that subroutine was error goes to caller. I can also find out the line, the file, and the package of that caller. If I use my error like a string, I get a pretty printed error message, and of course, if I don't want to handle the exception myself, I can always rethrow it. The other nice thing about autodie is that you can register your own error messages, both for your own subroutines and those built in for Perl. So if you wanted to, you could, for example, put together a language pack, so you can get error messages in your own language. Autodie will come standard with Perl 5.10.1, but if you're using Perl 5.10.0, you can also grab it from CPAN. So, with autodie, you can now love your errors in Perl. The audio and associated text slides used in this presentation may be distributed under the terms of the Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike license, or, at your option, the same license as Perl 5.10 itself. Image slides carry their own license. Please see the individual slides for details. These slides and the associated audio have been produced by Paul Fenwick from Perl Training Australia.